7, the conventional wells have been drilled as much as 7 years before that. The shale gas wells are younger, they're leaking at a higher rate. Curious? And then we said, well, okay, is there a difference between regions of the state? So we broke the state up into the non-northeast, N-East answer northeast. There are 7 counties. I'll show you which ones they were that we aggregated into the northeastern part of the state. And we found out that the northeastern counties' wells were leaking 5 times more frequently than the non-northeastern counties. Curious? Okay, well that's the past. We'd like to be able to explain the past, and I'll talk more about that. But let's look at what we predicted from the future. And to do that, you have to use what I would refer to as sophisticated probabilistic statistics. You don't want to just guess. You don't want to draw a straight line through the past and project into the future. That would be simple, but not very informative. So we asked the chair professor of probability and statistics at Cornell, Marty Wells, his last name really is Wells, to join the team, and he did a very sophisticated statistical probabilistic analysis of the past data to predict the future. And I'm going to present what the future will hold according to our predictions. These are predictions, they're not fact. They need to be borne out by future history. But I'm going to show you the results in a couple of different fashions. This first one, we're comparing conventional and unconventional. Unconventional means shale gas. So here's the prediction for conventional wells. Here's the prediction for unconventional wells. For all the wells that were drilled after 2009. And the way you interpret this graph is this is the time into the future that you want to project. So if you were to drill a conventional well today and ask what would be the probability, this is probability, what would be the probability that that well would be leaking a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, you would find 4 years from now you'd expect about 9% of those conventional wells to be leaking. But Professor Ingraffea, you just said that only about 1% of the conventional wells were leaking in the past. How can you now predict that 9% are going to be predicted in the future? That's the flaw of averages. When you look at all the conventional wells over 12 years and you throw them all into one basket and say what percentage are leaking, it's 1%. But if you say, if we just look at the conventional wells drilled in the last 4 years, the number is much higher. Now, why would conventional wells that historically weren't leaking very much now start leaking at a higher rate? Curious? Amazing what you can do when you look closely at data. If you look at unconventional, these are shale gas wells. We drill one today, a year from now, 2 years from now, 3, 4. By 4 years from now, we'd expect about 13% of those to be leaking, statewide, taking into account northeast counties, southwest counties, north central counties. So 13% of all of the shale gas wells to be drilled in Pennsylvania, I would expect them to be leaking in 4 years. Is that more or less consistent with the data that we saw from other studies in the industry? I think so. All right, here we're comparing northeast counties to non-northeast counties. And here are the counties that we put into the northeast. Again, this is not Northeast County. This is Northeast County. 4 years, 8 years. 8 years from now, we'd expect over 50% of the wells drilled in those counties to be leaking. That's a projection from past experience. Because we know that in the aggregate of all the wells drilled in those 9 counties, none of which were more than 5 years old when we did this study, 10% of them were already leaking after 5 years. It's not like they're going to stop leaking at a higher rate. Wells age, concrete shrinks, concrete cracks, casings corrode. So as time goes on, the rate of leaking will go up. And finally, we wanted to see what would happen if we looked at wells that were drilled before the revisions to Chapter 78 regulations, with those drilled after revisions to Chapter 78 regulations. Some of the revisions to Chapter 78 regulations included tougher regulations on casing and cement. So you'd expect to see an improvement in the rate of leaking. So blue means the wells that were drilled before 2009. Red means the wells that were drilled after 2009. And what you see is that we're projecting that after 2 years, the wells drilled after 2009, after tougher regulations, will be failing at a higher rate than the wells drilled before the tougher regulations, which proves, in my opinion, that regulations aren't worth a hoot. They're only words. What matters is execution. I don't mean killing somebody. I mean you do what you're supposed to do, what the regulation demands, and you do it well, and you're inspected. If you don't do it well, you do it over again, or you throw the well out. Okay, now there's a professor friend of mine at Syracuse, Don Siegel. Anybody familiar with his study that came out earlier this year? Published a paper and is trying to refute studies done by professors at Duke University which showed a relationship in the distance between a water well and a gas well in certain areas of Pennsylvania. The relationship that the Duke professors found is very simple. The closer your water well is to a gas well, the higher the concentration of methane in your water well. And Professor Siegel wrote a paper in which he says that's not true. And he got from the Chesapeake Corporation a database of over 10,000 water well tests, and he did sophisticated statistical analysis. But I want to point out that Professor Siegel is barking up the wrong tree. He's asking the wrong question. If you're a private water well owner in northeastern Pennsylvania, do you give a hoot whether your water well was 800 feet from a gas well or 8,000 feet from a gas well? Or do you only want to know, is my water well contaminated? Answer that. Okay, so Professor Siegel is asking a question which is academically interesting but practically useless. He's trying to refute another professor's paper. Well, that's what professors do to each other sometimes. But from a practical, empirical, on-the-ground point of view, the question I'm asking, I think, is the more important one. Is my water well being contaminated by a gas well? So I'll skip this because it gets into the details, but here's an example of how we're using our friends at Frac Tracker to help inform you, the public. Here is the study area outlined in blue. This is Bradford and parts of Susquehanna County. That's the study area that Professor Siegel used in his paper. And there are thousands of gas wells in that area. And he doesn't say anything in his paper about how many water wells are contaminated. That wasn't his objective. So we went in and we said, okay, well, what does all this mean? The black circles are locations of wells spudded in this 9-year period, which have been found by the PADEP to be leaking. Okay, so he says there's no correlation between the distance between a gas well and a water well, but there are gas wells that are leaking. They're the ones that the PADEP has officially declared are leaking, but that's an underestimate of the total number, as you well know, because the official number does not include, for example, wells that were leaking that were addressed privately between the landowner and the gas company. So that's an underestimate. It's a lower bound on the number of wells that are leaking. The red hexagons, there are a bunch of them here, a bunch of them here, many here, a few here, more here. Those are water supplies that have been determined by PADEP to have been positively impaired. That is, the DEP issued a determination letter to the owner of those water wells saying, your water well has been ruined by oil and gas operations. At least temporarily, maybe forever. So that information does not appear in Professor Siegel's paper. So again, I repeat, academically interesting, a food fight between professors, but from the point of view of boots on the ground, people who care, people who have water wells, what's more interesting is my water well contaminated? And we now know, this number has been revised, as of today, the PADEP has issued 260 positive determinations. 260 water well owners have received letters that look like this, redacted, because they won't tell you what the name of the owner of the water well is or the location. But it says, yeah, we've done some study on your water well, and you're right, your water well has been contaminated. And you can go online public information, and get a list. This is a part of the 260 positive determination letters, but there were 960 letters, 969 letters issued by PADEP. 260 said, yes, your water well is contaminated. About, I'm guessing now, and don't quote me on this, 300 or 400 said, no, your water well was not contaminated. And the others were, we're not sure. But it was released today by Frack Tracker and another organization whose name I already forgot, that there were 2,369 complaints by private water well owners in Pennsylvania during that period of time. 2,369, don't quote me on that number, close. But so far, only 960 letters of determination. The others are in limbo. All right, that's all bad news. The worst news is that right after we published our paper, the one I just described with the looking back and looking forward, right after we published the paper, the Auditor General of the state of Pennsylvania issued a report on the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection database, the one we used for our study, the one we had complete confidence in. It was going to be telling us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The publicly available one that we can analyze and report to you. I'm going to read you some of the findings of the Auditor General. 25-year-old policy on the frequency of inspections, which has a loophole that only requires DEP to conduct inspections as it has the financial and human resources to do so. Of the 41,000 wells we attempted to study, 8,000 had no records. No publicly available records. In other words, we go to the database for 8,000, 1/5 of the wells that were drilled in that 12-year period have no inspection records publicly available. And will never have. The Inspector General tested the data, the same kind of data that we were using to write our paper, for accuracy and found errors of more than 25% in key data fields, and that as many as 76% of the inspector's comments never appeared in the public record. There are two things involved here. Accuracy. Of those 41,000 wells, we had to throw out another 5,000 because we couldn't use the data. It was nonsense. For example, you can't have an inspection report that is dated before the well was drilled. Well, you could, if you were faking it, but it's error. But if you have a database that's full of errors, you can't use it. You throw it out. It doesn't become part of our record. Inspector comments were crucial. How do we determine from the database that a well is leaking? The inspector has to say it's leaking. And there are many ways that an inspector can say that. They can check off a box that says violation of article blah, blah, blah of chapter 78, which means the well is leaking, and or the inspector can literally write in his or her own handwriting, I have found this well to be leaking. We thought, when we read those 71,000 inspection reports, we were reading all the comments. No, we were reading 1/4 of the comments. So you can conclude that our paper is useless. Not quite. That would be an exaggeration, but our paper is an underestimate. We don't really know, looking back in retrospect, what percentage of shale gas wells and conventional wells drilled in that 12-year period are leaking, because the data is inadequate to support a real conclusion. So it was bad news, and it's worse because we don't have confidence in what we wrote in that paper. And I'll be misquoted on that. Professor Ingraffea does not have confidence in what he wrote in his paper. Yeah, I don't. Because the database in which we based it can't possibly be used in any confident manner. Okay, what does this all mean? We expect to see 25 to 30,000 additional shale gas wells drilled in the United States per year over the foreseeable future, if the price of oil and gas ever comes back up. And so if we know that a significant percentage of those wells will leak, as they always have, we can expect a significant number of contamination incidents in water wells. That's the conclusion. Water well contamination is not a thing of the past, it's a predictable thing